The last thing Christopher Reed's father ever said to him wasn't, "I love you." It was 6 words that would consume the next decade of his life. But before I tell you what those words were, you need to understand something about deathbed confessions. They're not always gentle. Sometimes they're not even kind. Sometimes a dying man will use his last breath to pass you a burden so heavy it'll bend your spine for the rest of your life. Christopher's father knew he was dying. The mine had been killing him slowly for 40 years, one shift at a time, one breath of coal dust at a time. But that day, lying in a hospital bed with machines beeping around him like a countdown clock, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about what he'd found. Christopher sat beside him, holding a hand that had once felt strong enough to lift mountains, but now felt like paper. His father's breathing was shallow, rattling. The nurse had said it would be any time now. That phrase, any time now, the cruelest words in the English language. And then his father's eyes snapped open. Not the cloudy, morphine-glazed eyes Christopher had been watching for hours. These were sharp, urgent, almost afraid. His father grabbed Christopher's wrist, and I mean grabbed it, with a strength that shouldn't have existed in a body that broken. He pulled Christopher close enough that Christopher could smell the antiseptic and the death and something else underneath it all. Dirt. His father smelled like the mine. Even here, even now. His father's lips barely moved, but Christopher heard every syllable. "Find what I left down there." Christopher started to ask what he meant. Where? What? Why? But his father's grip went slack. The monitor screamed, the nurses rushed in, and just like that, the only man who knew the answer was gone. You'd think the story ends there. Here's where it gets strange. The very next morning, before Christopher had even picked out a casket, the mine was sealed. Not closed, sealed. Steel barriers welded across every entrance, armed security posted at the gates. And when Christopher drove past the site the next week, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Government vehicles, not state, federal. His father had worked in a coal mine in a dying town in the middle of nowhere. So why did the U.S. government care enough to bury it in concrete? If you want to understand why Christopher spent 10 years obsessing over 6 words from a dead man, you need to understand who Christopher Reed was before that hospital room. He grew up poor. Not the kind of poor where you complain about not having the newest phone. The kind where your mother cuts your hair in the kitchen because a barber costs money you don't have. Where your winter coat is duct taped at the elbows. Where you learn not to ask for things because you already know the answer. Christopher's father worked in the mine. 40 years. Every single day he'd come home at dusk, his face so black with coal dust you could only see the whites of his eyes. He'd sit at the kitchen table, too tired to speak, and eat whatever Christopher's mother had stretched across 3 plates. And Christopher learned to be invisible in all the right ways. He never complained, never made trouble, never asked for anything. But he noticed everything. He noticed that his mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford to turn the heat on until November. He noticed that his younger brother's shoes had holes in them. He noticed that his father's cough, the one that sounded like gravel in a tin can, was getting worse every year. So when Christopher turned 16, he didn't ask for a car or a graduation party. He got a job. He started at the local inn washing dishes. Minimum wage, graveyard shifts. The kind of work that turns your hands red and raw. But Christopher showed up early, stayed late, and never once called in sick. Within 2 years, he was managing the front desk. By 22, he was the assistant manager. By 25, he was running the whole operation, and he was the best thing that had ever happened to that inn. People in town started saying things like, "That Reed boy's got a future." And for the first time in his life, Christopher started believing them. But here's the thing about growing up poor. Even when you're not poor anymore, you still feel poor. You still check price tags twice. You still panic when an unexpected bill arrives. You still carry that weight. Christopher had just started to set that weight down when the hospital called. 3 months after the funeral, Christopher got a letter that changed everything. A distant relative, someone so distant Christopher didn't even know they existed, had passed away. And for reasons the lawyer couldn't explain, they'd left Christopher a substantial inheritance. Not millions, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to finally stop counting every dollar. Now, most people in Christopher's position would have done one of two things: blown it on something flashy, or hoarded it like a dragon guarding gold. Christopher did neither. The first thing he did? He bought his mother a house. Not a mansion, a small, decent house with a working furnace and a porch where she could sit in the mornings with her coffee. She cried when he handed her the keys. 63 years old, and it was the first time she'd ever owned anything. The second thing? He moved his younger brother out of the apartment he'd been struggling in and made sure he had a safety net. And the third thing, this is the one that defines who Christopher Reed was, he built a community center. Not a gym, not a rec room with his name on a plaque, a real community center. With job training programs, with after-school tutoring for kids whose parents worked double shifts, with a food pantry that didn't ask questions. He did it because he remembered what it felt like to be the kid with duct-taped shoes, and he didn't want another kid to feel that way if he could help it. By the time Christopher turned 35, he'd married a woman named Judy, someone who matched his heart, his work ethic, his quiet strength. He had a good life, a stable life, but late at night, when Judy was asleep and the house was silent, Christopher would lie awake staring at the ceiling, and he'd feel it, that grip on his wrist, that voice in his ear. Find what I left down there. Here's what haunted Christopher. His father wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't tell stories. He worked, he came home, he slept. That was it. So why, on his deathbed, would he waste his last words on something that didn't matter? Christopher started digging. Not with a shovel, with a library card. He went to the County Historical Society and asked to see the mine records. The woman at the desk, Mrs. Halloway, who'd known Christopher since he was a boy, smiled and pulled out a box of files. Doing some family research, honey? Something like that. Christopher spread the files across the table and started reading. Employment records, safety reports, production logs. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Boring, bureaucratic, and covered in dust. But then, he found something strange. In the final year before the mine closed, production didn't drop. It spiked. The numbers showed the mine pulling more coal than it had in a decade. So why had the company told the workers the veins were running dry? Christopher kept digging. He found geological surveys, land deeds, inspection reports. And then he found a page that stopped him cold. A report from the month his father died, marked classified, restricted access. Christopher looked up at Mrs. Halloway. Why would a coal mine report be classified? She frowned. It shouldn't be. He tried to request the full file. He was told it didn't exist. He tried to FOIA it. The request was denied under national security exemptions. National security. For a coal mine. In a town nobody had heard of. That's when Christopher knew. Whatever his father had found, the government knew about it too. Christopher started tracking down his father's old co-workers, the men who'd been in the mine that final month. Most of them wouldn't even open the door. One man, a guy named Paulson, saw Christopher through the window and pulled the curtains shut without a word. But there was one man who finally broke. His name was Elias. He'd been a foreman at the mine, and he'd known Christopher's dad better than most. Christopher found him at a bar on the edge of town, nursing a beer at 2 in the afternoon. Christopher sat down next to him. Didn't say anything at first, just ordered a drink and waited. Finally, Elias spoke. You look just like him, you know, your old man. I've been told. Elias took a long drink. He was a good man, best I ever worked with. Then help me understand what happened to him. Elias set his glass down. His hand was shaking. Your father, he found something. Last few months before the collapse, he started acting strange, coming up late from his shifts, staring at his hands like he couldn't believe what he'd touched. Christopher leaned in. What did he find? I don't know. I swear to God I don't. But I know the company knew. They started closing off sections of the mine, sections that were still rich with coal. They told us it was unstable, but I've been down in those tunnels my whole life, Chris. There was nothing unstable about them. And then the accident? Elias looked Christopher dead in the eye. There was no accident. The words hung in the air between them. They collapsed that tunnel on purpose. Your father was the only one who wouldn't walk away from what he'd found. So they made sure he couldn't talk. Christopher's heart was pounding. Did they kill him? I don't know. But I know this. The day after he died, men in suits showed up. Federal agents. They boxed up his locker, his tools, everything. Told us the mine was being permanently sealed, and if we talked about what we saw down there, we'd lose our pensions. Elias finished his beer and stood up. Your father was protecting something, Chris. And whatever it was, they're still protecting it too. Christopher realized something important. He couldn't sneak into that mine. It was federal property now, locked down tighter than a prison. But there was one loophole. If he owned the land, they couldn't keep him out. Christopher spent the next 2 years working every political connection he had. He framed it as a legacy project, a son wanting to honor his father by purchasing the land and building a memorial. It was a perfect cover story. Sentimental, wholesome, impossible to argue against. The governor's office finally agreed to sell. The price was shockingly low, almost like they wanted to get rid of it. The day Christopher signed the papers, the governor walked him to the door, put a hand on his shoulder, and said something that made Christopher's skin crawl. Mr. Reed, some things are better left buried. Christopher drove home in silence. That night, he told Judy everything. The classified reports, the federal agents, Elias's warning. She listened. Then she took his hand. So what are you going to do? Christopher looked at her. I'm going to finish what my father started. Christopher went to the mine alone, not because he wanted to, because this moment belonged to him and his father, nobody else. He parked at the gate, cut the chain, and walked into the woods. The mine entrance was a quarter-mile in, swallowed by overgrowth and time. He pulled the vines aside, clicked on his headlamp, and stepped into the dark. The temperature dropped immediately. The air tasted like metal and stone and something older, something that had been sitting undisturbed for years. Christopher followed the main tunnel down. His boots crunched on gravel. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, echoing like a heartbeat. And then the tunnel opened up. Christopher stopped. The chamber in front of him was massive, and the walls were covered in veins of mineral that shimmered in his headlamp. Gold, copper, something else he didn't recognize. The mine wasn't depleted. It was rich. But that's not what made Christopher's breath catch. In the center of the chamber, arranged on a natural stone shelf, were objects. Stone tablets, carvings, tools made from materials that didn't match anything he'd seen before. Too precise for primitive tools, too weathered for anything modern. His father had found this, had spent months protecting it, had died keeping it secret. And then Christopher understood. This wasn't just a mine, it was a site. An archaeological treasure that rewrote everything they thought they knew about who had lived here, how long ago, how advanced they were. If the mining company had found this, they would have destroyed it, bulldozed it, sold the minerals and erased the history. His father had been the only thing standing between this place and oblivion. Christopher knelt down, ran his fingers over one of the tablets, and he felt his father's presence, not like a ghost, but like a promise kept. He wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed through the tunnel behind him. Christopher turned. A man stepped into the light, badge on his belt, hand near his holster. Mr. Reed, you need to leave. Now. Christopher stood slowly. This is my property. This site is under federal protection. You're trespassing. I own the deed. The officer didn't blink. Some things are more important than deeds. Christopher looked at him, then at the chamber, then back. My father died protecting this. I'm not leaving. The officer's jaw tightened. Then we have a problem. But Christopher had one advantage the officer didn't know about. Before coming down here, he'd called a team. Archaeologists, historians, a documentary crew. They were already on their way. What happened next became national news. The artifacts were examined by university researchers, dated, cataloged, published. They belonged to an indigenous civilization that existed thousands of years before any known settlement in the region. The discovery rewrote textbooks. It was one of the most significant archaeological finds in modern history. And Christopher Reed, the kid who grew up with duct tape shoes, became the man who made sure it saw the light of day. He could have sold it. Museums offered millions. Private collectors offered more. He turned them all down. Instead, he built a museum, right there on the land, hired local workers, trained local guides, and he made sure every artifact stayed exactly where his father had found it. The mine that had once been the town's livelihood, and then its graveyard, became its future. Tourists came, hotels filled, restaurants opened. Kids who were planning to leave stayed. At the museum's grand opening, Christopher stood at the podium. He looked out at the crowd, his mother, his brother, Judy, the faces of people he'd grown up with, and he told them the truth. My father spent 40 years in the dark, and in that darkness, he found something extraordinary. He didn't find it for himself. He didn't find it for money. He found it for all of us, and he gave his life making sure it would still be here when we were ready to see it. Christopher paused. His voice cracked just slightly. A legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you make possible for everyone who comes after. That night, Christopher walked back to the mine entrance, alone. He stood there in the quiet, listening to the wind move through the trees, and he whispered 6 words into the dark. I found what you left, Dad. If this story moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It tells YouTube to show this to more people, and stories like this deserve to be heard. Subscribe if you haven't already. We've got more incredible true stories coming your way. And drop a comment. Tell me, have you ever made a promise to someone that changed your life? I'll see you in the next one.